Ladies and gentlemen, we will now hear from our closing panel, International Perspectives and How Ontario Fares. Please join me in welcoming Pavel Richter, CEO of Open Knowledge International, Nosa Iro-Brown, Director of the Open Government Office, Ontario's Treasury Board Secretariat, Jean Noe-Landry, Executive Director of Open North, and once again, our lovely moderator, Richard Garner. Richard, take it away.
Big spotlight.
I know, it's like...
Thank you, Shelley. Testing. Okay, yeah, we're good. So we'll get right to it because we know that there's always a lot to talk about and we're trying to stick to time here. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. A lot of great panels, a lot of great breakout sessions today. As we talked about earlier, and as I'm sure you're all familiar with, open is the theme for this year's Think Conference 2017. And as we discussed earlier today, I mean, you can argue there's subjectivity to that. X amount of people can see that differently and interpret that differently. At the digital level, I think we have a general understanding, as we kind of joked about earlier today, that we're essentially openists if we're A, on this panel, but B, if you're in the digital community, period, whether it be here in Ontario or around the world, you see the future of innovation and progress being directly linked to collaboration, and of course you can draw the tree from collaboration to openness. So it seems logical and it seems like an obvious way to go, but as we know, especially when we get to the international spectrum, getting people to work together and open up, whether it be around data or information or networks, whether it be just transparency or IP or protectionism, whatever it is, there's still resistance out there that is less arguably than maybe 20 years ago. But these days, as I think Pavel will discuss as well, we've seen a bit of a backlash, at least at a behavioral or sociological level. So as we start off this conversation around the international perspective on openness, we'll start with Pavel. Give us a little background on your organization and specifically to the context of data.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. Open Knowledge International, formerly known as the Open Knowledge Foundation, is around for quite a while now, for 13 years. We were founded in 2004 in Cambridge by Dr. Rufus Pollock. And back then the idea was to actually build the space for openness, to define what openness is. You can look it up, what we did back then under the website opendefinition.org, where we tried to actually define openness. But it was also building the technical infrastructure that's needed to make data available. A very prominent piece of software that was written by Open Knowledge International is called CCAN, and it runs most of the big data portals like data.gov or data.gov.uk. Nowadays, this is still what we do. So we do open up data and we make data available, and we work with communities and civil society organizations and governments to make data available. But our main focus right now, and I'm pretty sure we're going to speak about this more on this panel in various variations, is to make sure that the data is actually used in a way that it improves people's lives. So we try to work with civil society organizations in particular to help them understand the value openness and specifically open data can have for their particular mission. So if you're a human rights organization, your modus operandi is probably doing a lot of advocacy, a lot of campaigning, writing letters to governments. What about, is there a role for open data in the fight for human rights? And if so, what kind of data do you need? Where do you get the data? What do you do with it when you have the data? How do you work with data, learning the tools and the skills around open data? That's basically what we do.
And whether that's, again, at the international level or here in Canada, we're gonna see that the micro and the macro, as they often do, they intersect, they overlap. We probably confront a lot of the same challenges, as well as share a lot of the progress and successes that you guys have had over your, almost 15 years of being around. But Jean-Noé, you can speak to it from the perspective at Open North. Talk a little bit about Open North and what your experience is around openness.
I mean, it's interesting to have Pavel on the on this panel right now, because we have also kind of gone through different iterations, and our mission has evolved as the open data community has so as well. So Open North was founded in 2010, 2011, and very much part of kind of the civic tech and open data community. So if you're familiar with organizations like his or My Society or the Sunlight Foundation, we're part of that same wave. And we were really intended originally as an organization that not only advocated for more openness and open data, and initially that took the form of looking at open data policies, for example, and really kind of developing the normative frameworks and understandings of what do we mean by open. And then we gradually moved into building open data portals using CCAN, for example. So we used CCAN, we were the first ones to use CCANs in Canada, with the first municipalities that did that. But the conversation has changed as more people has become part of it. And the types of problems that we're seeing locally are now, way more connected to the communities of practice internationally as well. So for Open North, our approach is really about connecting what's going on locally to what's going on globally, and what's going on globally to what's going on locally. And we really have a problem definition and a problem kind of focused approach to the way that we do our work. So one of our collaborators and the way that we've been involved in kind of growing the open data community here has been to diversify the open data community. Because I actually think that when we talk about openness in Canada, there isn't a single open data community. There are many communities of openness. And I think this conference is actually a very good example of that. So you could take issues around, housing or water or, mobility and whatnot, right? So we're looking at, different communities, different types of expertise that need to talk to each other and collaborate in ways that, wasn't necessarily the case before. And data becomes kind of the way to kind of bring that kind of electricity through that collaboration process. Maybe just a couple of examples of projects that we're doing. And one where we're very excited about here in Ontario is around the International Open Data Charter. So if you're not familiar with the International Open Data Charter, this is really actually a sign of the evolution of the open data movement globally, whereby we need to have a common understanding of what we mean by open, and this then enables governments at different levels of jurisdiction to abide by a similar set of principles. So this, from an advocacy perspective, is very important to us. So this means that we can build coalitions and alliances that have a very clear set of goal and purpose in order to advocate more effectively with government in terms of what we mean by open. And the more governments adopt the International Open Data Charter, then we finally get into conversations about interoperability and data sharing that really makes our lives as data users much more efficient. So, Ontario has, plans to adopt the Open Data Charter. The City of Edmonton has adopted the Open Data Charter, and we're now in touch with numerous other cities in Canada. So the benefits are not just for Canada, they're for the whole kind of global open data community. And one quick example of a project on data that we're doing that will probably resonate with you is, sometimes it's kind of surprising. It's the things that you do that you get the least, the things that you do where you don't necessarily get the most revenue, but that are the most impactful. Okay, and I'll give you an example, which is our Represent API, which is the biggest database of elected officials in Canada. So we pull this from different sources. We've advocated with different government in terms of adopting a common standards. We pull this together into this API, and then we help nonprofits, media organizations, researchers, and others to deploy their API in their campaigns and infrastructure and whatnot. So that's really kind of data as infrastructure, as a public good that collaboratively brings different stakeholders together in ways of maximizing and enhancing their ability to carry out their mission and mandates.
And would I be close to saying, Nosa, that that's somewhere in your job description? What was just, because you are at a stage where this is the major focus of your portfolio. Talk about that as sort of the evolution of your time with overseeing that and what the plans are going forward.
Absolutely. So just to pick up the thread from Jean-Louis, so the province of Ontario, which is where we represent today, has actually adopted the Open Data Charter. Yes. So that's fantastic. So just walking backwards from there, the organization that I represent is Treasury Board Secretariat, and we have the mandate to actually carry out and operationalize what this gentleman have just talked about in terms of being open within government. So Treasury Board has the mandate to look across government and figure out how to have an action plan that prepares us for being open. And for Ontario, what that looks like is we have an action plan that's on ontario.ca, so if you have the opportunity to go there and check out the plan, that really speaks to openness across several dimensions, including open data, having better conversations around open dialogue, and actually proactively releasing information that the public wants and needs. So what we've done is really embark on a transformational journey that turns on its head the idea of privacy and government as a closed silo to being open by default, which is our plan. So on the topic of open data in particular, what we've done since 2013 is create an open data policy, and we leverage principles from open knowledge and other jurisdictions to create Ontario's own open data policy. It was the first time that we were actually developing a policy, a government document or a directive is what we call it in the province of Ontario, that we actually co-created it with the public. So we put this out online. It looks simple. It looks like something that we should have done a long time ago. But for government, this was a huge transformational shift, not to have all of the answers at the onset. And that's a shift towards openness and collaboration and putting trust in our partners outside of government, that they would tell us what it is that they need to see as part of our action plan. So once we developed that policy, we've started to do things like release our inventory of data, which I'm really excited to let you know. I think that would be really good for this group to know that we have a great inventory to start with of thousands of data sets that even us in government were not aware of.
Wow.
And I think that's quite impactful to be able to have all of this in one place, whether it's open or not, just starting with the foundation of what it is that you have. What can we have a conversation about? Where do we go from here? I think that's really changing the culture now that we've opened it and we're getting the civil service more comfortable with this notion. Then we can start moving from the notion of just being transparent and opening our doors to more engagement, to more participation, and actually co-creating things with the public. So I'll give you two examples of areas where we've sort of moved the yardstick on that. There is a very government-y document called public accounts that's usually released in the past in this very thick documents of tables and facts that only those of us behind the scenes actually know all of the details. But what we did was take that, simplify it, turn it into open data that people can actually see and use, and then visualize it. So you have a better understanding of how money is spent. And to John Noe's point, these are things that are not the shiny objects, but they make a huge difference. Another example is we have the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, for example, that releases data on fishing locations, and people can actually crowdsource and send into the ministry where they fish, the quality of the fish that they catch, and we use it to update the database and share that database back out to Ontarians. And that dialogue with data, I would argue, is actually what's more important than releasing the data sets, which is part of the mandate that we have.
Wildly exciting to hear, words like co-creation, I think. And it's so interesting because, even today we were talking about, how do you have conversations like the ones you have here, and then how do you sort of collaborate and come together, as a coalition or in a mobilized fashion to then approach government and work with government. But what I'm also hearing here too is that perhaps in response to the world that we're living in, government is also now understanding that even the methodology and the process is outdated in terms of how you're going to work. And this has to be very difficult for a hierarchy, let's say, that has been used to a certain way of working for a long time, but this doesn't sound like a small tweak. This sounds like the ramifications of this are massive. Obviously, that's been discussed. Are people behind closed doors like, are there arguments? Are people like, are you crazy? We can't do that? Because this isn't small.
Yeah, no, all of the above. So I think the culture change is exciting, but you can just imagine for a massive organization like the Public Service in Ontario, over 60,000 people, this is not going to be, the easy ship to turn around. So I think there are a number of things that we're trying to do on the inside to get folks comfortable with the idea of working out loud, working in public, co-creating, and getting Ontarians in at the beginning of initiatives, rather than waiting to the end and we say, here's the view that you can see. And part of that is looking at our internal processes as well. So when I first started with the Open Government Office about 2 years ago, one of the things that I looked at was our process for releasing data. And I don't know if there are people here from the OPS, and I speak on my behalf, but there were no less than 13 people that had to sign off on one data set to get released. Just think about that.
Yeah.
You need to release one thing. You're going to this person, and then to this, and then to that.
The definition really of the stereotypes that people make about
exactly,
government.
and that's what, and we're going, how do you change this so people are comfortable with not releasing perfect, right? And assuming that risk that, the public could see this, there could be risk of embarrassment to the government, there could be all that, but how do we make ourselves comfortable with that? And we've been able to take that process, really simplify it and say, hey, disclaimer, we're working on this with you. And I think the response has been really positive, that the feedback we get, even to errors to data sets, are great. Thanks for noticing that. Or, excellent, we can work with you on this. And I think that's what's making our officials more and more comfortable, that people understand that, one, scandal could shut this thing down, and we're hoping that that doesn't happen, right? And I think that we're ready, just the way that our stakeholders are.
And I'm guessing this would somehow echo some of the things you've seen, Pavel, at an international level.
Because what Northern just said is a very good example of developments we see all over the place. First, open data is not a file. Open data is a process. It's not about a data set that is open. It is about changing how governments work, how corporations work. Open data is a process. That's the first important learning. The second one is that open data is that governments are large providers of open data, but they are also large users and customers for open data. And I think that's something that we have overlooked for a while, but it's a very important aspect that to get governments to open up data and make data available is by showcasing that they benefit themselves by using these data sets. So there's a famous example in the UK a couple of years ago, when they found out through open data that various agencies within a government commissioned the exact same report, which costs thousands of pounds each time they commissioned that report. And it's the exact same report. They didn't knew that a couple of offices down the hall, somebody had the exact same report commissioned as well. Saved the UK government £5 million in an afternoon, simply by collecting and understanding their own data. So I think these are important learnings for governments globally, not only here in Canada.
Well, it's interesting. I had this conversation recently with my father, actually, but I mean, an 82-year-old guy, a simple guy, he asked, not rhetorically, he was like, well, we were talking about cancer, right? And he was talking about, the cure for cancer, which is obviously a bit of a catch-all phrase, but he was saying, well, wouldn't we have much more progress in getting there if people shared the information that they were working on in different silos of research. And I think my initial response was, well, Dad, you're being naive. The world we live in, you know, you got to think about intellectual property and people are developing drugs. And of course, there's much more collaboration in research than there ever has been. So I don't want to pretend that there's none, but the fear that we're all talking about at the end of the day, this is behavioral and sociological as much as it is certainly a technological issue, is that we have, at least this generation, perhaps people who are younger than I are like, I don't even understand what you're saying. But certainly the people who are in power, whether it be at the corporate level or the government level for the most part, have been conditioned to protect. That information is power, information is revenue, and how do we overcome something like that without it being forced in a way that makes people uncomfortable? Jean, what do you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, and I think when you do like trainings like we do with public servants at different levels of government, when you want to have a specific conversation about like openness and open data, and often what they want to talk to you about is access to information requests and how burdensome it is on their time and their bureaucracy, and how much money it actually takes, and how do we solve that problem, and what's the connection between an open by default approach and moving more closer to proactive disclosure of documentation, especially when there's already been requests that have been made for similar pieces of information or data or reports. And it's true that we often undermine that the users and beneficiaries of sharing information and data on open data portals is government itself. For the federal government open data portal, it's about 20 to 22% of users are actually from inside the federal public service. We can quantify that. That's not difficult to do, right? So I think there's different issues there, but I just wanted to go back quickly to a point that Nosa made about the idea of like discoverability. So there is vast amount of data that is either available in an open data format or could be. And I think we need to kind of shift the way that we look at how do we engage with different communities of practice and data users, and really have a much more targeted, kind of context-driven appreciation of the type of uses that they want to have or make with that data. And the other side of that is understanding from which context the data, people who collect data and data managers are coming from as well. So what choices have been made in collecting data? Is there a way that we could maybe shift that a little bit for the benefit of the users down the life cycle kind of process of data management and data curation? Mm-hmm. So we need to move past this kind of, push and pull of open data. There's still some validity to that, but we all know now, in the open data community that, simply putting data sets, and high volumes of data sets on an open data portal is simply insufficient. So the engagement and retroaction piece is very, very important right now.
Well, you touch on something that we talked about before on our call, which is who decides, right? Because this is a whole other sort of elephant in the room. Who ultimately decides where the line is drawn, what is open, what should be open, what shouldn't be open? And, and Pavel, you and I talked earlier, let's use WikiLeaks as an example, right? The extreme of everything should be available to everybody. That's true democracy. That's true representation of, being able to understand as people what's really going on. But you had a very interesting sort of balance that you strike at Open Knowledge with, again, the role of the whistleblower, I couldn't be more supportive of. It's clearly undervalued, I would say, and underprotected in our world. But the difference between somebody, let's say, stealing your data and publishing it versus more towards a sea change of just getting people on board and understanding that they need to be open with it.
Well, it comes back to that open data is not a file, but a process. Even if you take a data set and just put it out there, it gets pretty quickly outdated. You need to curate data, you need to look after it. So you need the consent of the data publisher so that you get it and continue to get it in high quality. So simply taking a data set and putting it on a torrent won't really solve a problem. But Nusa mentioned the Global Open Data Charter, and the very first principle of that charter is open by default. And I think there lies a pretty good part of the solution for that problem. If everything is open by default, that doesn't mean that everything is open, but it means that if you want to close something, you need the 13 signatures you mentioned earlier to simply close the file. And that will automatically improve openness significantly.
But also invite, I would guess, the appropriate amount of scrutiny that you should require when somebody says this has to be closed.
Of course.
They need to be able to justify why it is that it should be closed in a way that isn't just because, look, we know better than you. And that's been sort of the government, you know, look, we're going to redact information, because we're the adults and you're the children. That sounds like at a government level that's shifting.
Right, it is absolutely shifted. And I think that with what Pavel was talking about, from the Ontario government perspective, I think what we've really tried to do is, you know, we have an open data directive that says data will be open by default. And to the issue about it being a process, yes, it's open by default, but then government still has a duty to protect privacy, security, commercial sensitivity, and cabinet confidentiality, like maintain those things, right? So open by default, but where are those parameters where things cannot be made open? But I think there's also, you know, taking a step back, we've also tried to be as transparent as possible. So where the data or information cannot be made open, we say why. So it's not that you don't know that we don't have or collect this information. We're transparent with that. Yes, we have this information. Here's why it's not released as open data, right? And there are some that actually do get challenged on a regular basis, where, you know, it's that you've said this cannot be released for, you know, security reasons. Can you tell me why? Why is this commercially sensitive? And then we can go into the process and discussing it and having a dialogue. But yes, it's open by default. We still have that sort of risk assessment rule or management rule to look at to say, you know, how can we release things as custodians of data that belongs to Ontarians, but how can we do that in a meaningful way that respects what we're being charged to look at?
Well, we've all heard the term, if you have nothing, you know, if you have nothing to hide, what's your fear about whatever? And I mean, you know, it certainly feels like a red flag to me, and feels like some sort of dystopian sci-fi thriller, or at least the basis of one. How do you balance the gap between transparency and privacy in a real way, Jean-Noé?
In a real way? Well, I mean, I think you need to pick your battles as well, right? And I think if you're, and here I'm speaking from a kind of an open data kind of activist perspective, you're not going to start talking right away about, you know, some data sets that are a little bit more sensitive to, you know, your interlocutors and the relationships that you want to build, you know, with your city officials, right? For example, when I first started doing open data with Open Montreal, which was a civic initiative, entirely citizen-driven, we weren't talking about corruption and collusion. This was back in like 2010. Those were the issues that we really wanted to talk about, right? That's why we mobilized.
You saw the end
together.
of that movie.
Well, you know, I think the movie's not ended yet. You know? And so, you know, what we were concerned about is, you know, how do we go from talking about potholes to talking about procurement? Right? That was really the conversation that we wanted to have. And so, you know, talking about kind of privacy and risk, you know, I think, you know, we needed to also have a certain level of empathy, right, for decision makers to understand, you know, how difficult it was there, and find a balance between injecting some kind of, in French you would say like tension utile, so like a certain kind of useful tension. Okay, where you're able to probe just enough and like keep the conversation moving in a level of comfort, but then also just be just sufficiently uncomfortable to make your case known, so that there's an opportunity there that isn't just cast as a challenge, right, for the shift that you have in mind. So that takes, you know, some kind of fine tuning in terms of your messages and whatnot, but being aware of, you know, the perceived risks with the people that you're trying to influence is very important. And that requires kind of stepping out of your own shoes and kind of understanding where people are coming from as well.
Resistance is often tied, I mean, let's face it, I mean, this particular species, our track record with change, not great, right? And often what confuses us is that, especially if we're telling the story to somebody after the fact and you're explaining how things used to be 50 years ago, and they're like, but how could you not see this was, and you're like, I know it made no logical sense, it had no rational case to be made for it, yet it took us 10, 20 years longer than it should have to get to, and this is, again, this is sociological and psychological as to our resistance to change. What about the timing, Pavel, did you guys notice? Because sometimes maybe the, you know, the idea is there or the time is right, but people aren't ready. And do you ever sort of say, okay, we got to take a foot off the gas and relax, and maybe to your point, John, away, you know, bite off this before we bite off that?
I really like the notion of pick your battles. I think that's important, and the transparency now and transparency to 100%, and we want it all and we want it now, is not only wrong from a time perspective, it is also not good politics and not good policy. Let's just admit that there are legitimate concerns around privacy, and let's admit that even the most progressive of governments is a very slow changing system, because it is not built for quick and rapid
and there
change.
Needs to be due diligence,
yes,
right?
And yes, we want that.
Well,
so
yes.
I would also so talking about privacy when we talk about open data is a very important aspect. What I think is sometimes overlooked here is that open data also levels the playing field in a very particular way, because a lot of your private data is out there for sale. If I'm a large corporation, I can buy a lot of information about you. That is already there. So if I'm a corporation and I need information, I can buy it. But what if I am a civil society organization that wants to fight corruption, for example, and I need information about, for example, the tax of my politicians? How do I get that information if I do not have the resources? So providing certain data to civil society organizations allows them to do the exact same thing that a corporation already can do by buying data. So again, that does not mean make everything that Facebook knows about you publicly. I wouldn't advocate for that. Sure. But making sure that civil society organizations have a level playing field. The second aspect is, and I think that's important for everybody in this room, is about data ownership. It's about that it is my data, and even so I'm giving it to Facebook or I'm giving it to Google or wherever, it still needs to be my data. So I want to continue to have the right on my data, and I want to be the one who says what I want to do with it. If I want to share it with somebody else, if I want to take it. So making corporations, especially social media corporations, accountable for giving me my data back if I want it back. I think that would go a long way in terms of empowerment for individuals to look after their own data. And we all have to be way more data literate and understanding of what my data and what our data is.
It seems that, I mean, the destiny of, let's say, the internet world always seemed to ultimately arrive at some point to some close to 100% openness, let's say. And initially it was providing some framework, then the connectivity, the pipes, if you will, whatever, for that potential to be realized. And maybe the last piece of the puzzle is ultimately the data, right? I mean, because that's the sensitive area of, like you said, where, you know, people might feel exposed, rightly or wrongly. So in that from a government perspective, and this is interesting to me now because we're seeing a bit of chicken and the egg these days now, where leadership on things like this used to come from government or hierarchy. Right. Even at a private sector level, it was still at a hierarchy, and sort of whatever. And for the last X amount of time, it's sort of bubbling to the surface from a more horizontal perspective. And then in Ontario's context, you're responding more to what's going on versus deciding that this was the way to go. Right. Is this the way we see governance? And we'll let you answer last. Okay. Do you see this being the beginning of a shift entirely in terms of how the world is governed? And should it be?
Oh, wow. Well, let me answer it that way. I always are very doubtful to think that there are technical solutions to social problems. Yeah. So simply because there is something like open data, that is not the change. That is something that is needed for a change, but it's not the solution. And the question in which direction our governments go, if they are more open, more democratic, more inclusive, has way more to do about with a lot of other factors than openness per se. So I would be very careful to put open data front and center in that, and because it would ignore the powers that are actually working against openness and against democracies and against
which are still out there. And
yes, there are a lot of examples, especially in Western democracies. Something we probably wouldn't have expected a year and a half ago. So we need to be very vigilant here.
I mean, I think the emphasis on relationships and partnerships is never going to go away, and that's something that I think as we've moved forward on open data, and we've seen kind of an evolution of the open data conversation and the maturity of kind of the ecosystem here in Canada and elsewhere, relationships is, what matters the most. It's not necessarily a technical, issue. Obviously it is in some regard, but, you need to be able to talk to people and to address their concerns and whatnot. One thing that we've been doing kind of recently on this point in terms of protecting personal data and the ethics of open data is to look at the notion of data sovereignty. So personal data sovereignty, but then also indigenous data sovereignty. And from data sovereignty on a nation-to-nation basis, we've been looking at the EU and how it deals with all these different kind of complex ways of managing and sharing data, and brought that back to Canada in the context of looking at indigenous data sovereignty and what it means in terms of the relationship between the Canadian government and the number of different nations that are spread out across this country, and what rights do they have in terms of managing, collecting, controlling the consent and the context of their own data. So I think if we're serious as a country, and this is an opportunity for Canada to be a leader internationally, is how do we align the open data and open government conversation with these transnational issues, especially on indigenous data sovereignty. And I think there's a great opportunity for Canada to kind of bring that conversation into much more nuanced kind of understanding of, not just dealing with stakeholders, but dealing on a nation-to-nation basis and looking at the ethics of open data at the core of that conversation. And
more specifically, Ontario. Right. I mean, I'm guessing you guys are recognizing this potential to be leaders.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that, I agree with the gentleman on the panel. We recognize that, but there is no doubt that the role of government is changing in all of this, right? There's still a huge role to play, and we're looking at things like, the big, wicked policy questions that need to be answered. So if you're doing things like crowdsourcing, for example, what's the role of the government then in what it is that we get? In shaping that, right? And that speaks to a number of issues around equity and access. And there are whole swaths of the population that are not part of this conversation. And how do we bring that? What's the role of government in bringing those voices to bear? And I think these are wicked problems that we don't claim to have the answers to. But the important thing is Ontario is looking at having that dialogue, and we've started to have those conversations with the federal government by aligning ourselves to the Open Government Partnership, for example. That's a key way to start to look at how other governments are looking at this and what direction that they're going to, and how we can best align our efforts.
I mean, it's wild times to say the least. I mean, you could have said that probably at most times in history, but specifically now, because the changes that we end up talking about are happening kind of under our feet, regardless of whether we've finalized the decision on how they should happen, which is sometimes we wake up and it's already happened. I mean, I think we talked last year on this panel about, you know, what happened with Uber in Toronto, which was this, you know, and just speaks to the speed or the change that, well, you know, we're not going to whatever, and then cut to John Tory's having a press conference about, well, I mean, Uber's already here, so we're going to have to figure out how to live with it. So to me, that was a very, you know, sort of a telling example going forward of how government kind of got surprised by something that was going to happen, whether they had legislated it or not. As we speak to data and we speak to connectivity, again, we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves and forget the fact that the world is still not entirely connected. We've talked about this human right and charters and stuff, but as the world starts to recognize, and I know Ontario has recognized that as well, and the right and access to connectivity is now essentially becoming recognized as a human right. First of all, I guess Ontario, how big of a priority is that, and how close is, let's say, a 100% solution? And I'm not saying that's going to happen tomorrow. And I guess, Pavel, I'll also be interested to hear where the numbers are at and how they're evolving at a world level.
So, you know, again, like I mentioned, these are all issues that we grapple with on the inside, and how, you know, far ahead can we get in front of these issues versus, you know, having planned, thoughtful, meaningful sort of responses to it. A lot of things, even like with open data, are, you know, it was already happening before we decided, oh, we better, you know, have a policy and do stuff like that. But I think the readiness to be proactive, to look at what Ontarians, not just Ontarians, just Canadians in general and people around the world are demanding, and the responsiveness that they're demanding, it's what's causing us to look at our role as government. So we're not the policy experts anymore that we used to be, you know, years ago, and say, you know, we will define what the issue is and let you know what that is. It's looking at how we start to have these conversations a little bit differently.
So we at Open Knowledge International, we publish once a year something called the Global Open Data Index, where we try to rank together with communities in over 90 countries, where we try to rank openness amongst government. Canada is on a very good place, 5th place, so it's terrific. There are two particular, so we track about 25 different data categories, from budget data to weather data and stuff like this, and if it's open and machine readable and all this. There are always two categories where nearly no country in the world has opened up the data. One is tax data on a corporate level, and the second one is land ownership. Not even Canada is publishing land ownership data as open data. So what that tells us is that first, there's still something to do, but it also, I think we need to do two things here on a global as well as on a local level. One is pressuring governments to open these kind of data sets. But I think what we have learned together as a community, as activists, is by simply pressuring and shaming governments into opening data, that's hardly working. It's very complicated and it takes a lot of time. I think the smarter approach is what I've just learned is called here in Canada open data in reverse, where we define what we need data for and what the kind of solution, the kind of problem we want to solve. Then we try to find out the kind of data we would need to solve that problem, and then we go to governments on a local or on a multinational level and tell them, look, this is why we need exactly this kind of information to solve this problem. Gets us way better results than simply demanding open it up, and we're going to use it afterwards.
Well, in the spirit of openness, we're going to open the floor to questions. I think there's a mic out there, so anybody that feels like asking a question or being involved in the conversation, let us know and we'll get the mic to you. While we wait, I guess, Jean-Noé, on that same point, I mean, are you happy with the progress of where things are at? I mean, I'm sure
more you can
happy is a subjective term, but there's always more room for growth, but
Yeah.
are we going in the right direction?
I mean, I think we are, generally speaking, but I think, there's this notion of like open washing and open wishing now that we're seeing more and more kind of in the kind of open data community, right? That you put out a few data sets and then you call it a day, and then you kind of really have a very strong communication kind of strategy to promote, what data you're making available. But I think we're at the stage now where we're looking at kind of real kind of like systemic challenges, right, in the way that data is collected and used and by whom and for whom. And a term that resonates well with me is the notion of data poverty, which I'm not sure if we've mentioned this in maybe some of the concurred sessions that took place earlier today. The data poverty concept, I mean, I took that from the New York City playbook on open data, whereby, they went to the 5 different boroughs in the city of New York and then talked to different communities and really kind of did a very kind of rigorous mapping exercise of understanding, well, what do we know that we know, and why do we not know the things that we don't? And how can we, really kind of have that level playing field in a way that we also recognize, who's not in this room right now talking about openness, and how do we, become better at being more inclusive and empowering and respectful in a way that really connects with the underpinning values of the open data movement. Because, we have a lot to learn from other movements, whether they're on like a social justice side or different, types of communities. So we need to bring, their experience in expanding and scaling, the open data conversation.
Cool. We have a question?
Hello. As a side note, open cancer is a very real thing, and they're on GitHub. So in reference to your conversation with your father. My question is over the next 10 to 15 years, millennials will make up almost 40% of the workforce world time. How do you see the millennials making maybe the barriers a non-issue, or how do you see them just blowing this wide open or not?
Sorry, the question was, how do we see them being engaged in open data? So this is actually interesting, because that's one area that I'm particularly interested in how we engage youth, especially those in university and sort of high school right now. So one of the approaches that we've taken for the Ontario government is having open data, open government principles embedded in some curriculum. So we've started to look for ways to partner with academic institutions like Ryerson, like University of Toronto, and having them come work with government as part of their education using real open data and starting to see the processes from that angle versus a civics course where, here's how you learn about government. But exposing sort of our machinery through open data to them. And we had a very engaging course last fall with the University of Toronto, very young students that actually developed different sort of prototypes and ways that we could approach some of the processes within government, or even approach engaging youth. So we have a very sort of textbook way of engaging with youth and social media where we reach them and all of that. And they were telling us, what, we have so many apps, we overload and all of that. Here's how you can engage with us using the data that you have. And it was very eye-opening. Again, something that we don't typically do, but coming to them at the beginning when they're doing their courses. So that's one way that we've started to look at engaging young people.
Co-creation again. I mean, my assumption on this is that this type of conversation at some point soon will be much ado about nothing. Mm-hmm. Because it really is, I don't think you can overstate the sociological impact or even anthropological impact of growing up never having known a different world than an internet world and a connected world, and certainly different perspectives, at least on privacy and transparency, that are fundamentally different than certainly somebody my age at 48, and I can only imagine in 20 years. So, would I be right to assume that alone will start to accelerate the process?
Well, maybe just a couple of thoughts about that. I mean, we talk about the millennials often as a kind of homogeneous kind of group, right? So the first thing is to, okay, who are the millennials? How do we break that apart? How do we understand kind of the more nuances of, different profiles and whatnot? I think Apathy is Boring is an organization that just produced a very interesting report on, millennials in Canada. But to your point, I think we're spending more time and energy trying to define ways of being able to onboard, millennials in terms of attracting talent to innovate and to help government. But I think we also need to find ways of better offboarding, folks that have been there for quite some time, and to really get into this intergenerational change that's happening within the public service, so that we don't just focus on, okay, there's a new generation that's coming in. It has all of this kind of, baggage, ways of doing things differently. But, as a society and as a country, I think it's very important for us to kind of connect those, that cycle of the labor force now, or else we're going to lose a lot of the context for the programs that we've been, investing in over years and years and years. So if somebody comes in with some new ideas and new techniques that can bring more efficiency to government, great. But has that been tried before? And why are we doing what we've been doing for all that time? So we can't lose that context. I think there's a risk there that would be a missed opportunity for us.
Pavel?
I think there are only very selected few who get really excited about open data in their early 20s. There are these people, and they're great, and they're part of the great open data community. But I would think that most people get excited about change that they can actually influence, and being engaged, and being of value and having an impact. And I think as long as that is a possibility in a society, then they will use the tools they need, and data and open data will be a tool like that. What I'm more afraid of, to be honest, is that the generation who's between 15 and 20 now is more and more getting used to an internet that is far away from being open and free, as we have known it, as I have learned it within the last 15 to 20 years. So if I look at the net neutrality disaster that is happening all over the world right now, not only in the US, if I'm looking at what kind of censorship in the internet is promoted through what is called hate speech legislation, I really, really fear that the internet is not becoming, or is becoming more and more a closed place. And that would be my much larger fear towards millennials
going backwards.
Going backwards in the technical infrastructure and getting used to it. Well, yeah, YouTube is that's really fast video streaming without knowing that it's fast because they're paying for it, which means that if I don't pay for it, I don't get a fast service.
Yeah, it would be interesting if they're hearkening back to the days of, do you remember when the internet used to be this wild and free, Wild West, and now it's not? And it's good that you brought that up, because we would have been remiss had that not been at least tabled here today. Kathy, we had a question? Hi.
I was told to make this quick because this is the last question.
Okay, take your time.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a very interesting panel, and I have a question from the municipal perspective. So I'm very interested in learning that the province of Ontario has made so much progress on this front, and we heard about that in the previous panel too on open data and papers. And just wondering if kind of best practices, or if there's any interest from the provincial perspective on working with municipalities in Ontario for commitment to doing so, because as you know, municipalities are at really different stages in this game. Some municipalities have a chief information officer and many do not, etc. And so how can the province use what it's learned to help municipalities?
I think that's a great question. We have started to look at ways to build municipal capacity. As you may or may not be aware, the scope of our work right now covers ministries and provincial agencies, but municipalities and building that ecosystem is absolutely important to us. So as part of adopting the International Open Data Charter, that is actually one of our commitments, is looking at a way to build capacity at the municipal level. So working with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, one of the ways that we're going to be doing that is looking at organizations that can help to replicate some of the early wins and early successes at the provincial level to enable the capacity at the municipal level. We're also looking at grassroots sort of movements like public sector open data, where we just share learnings every couple of weeks. Here's what we learned, here's the pains that we went through, here's what you need to do not to go through that, and really just open up most of our systems to our municipalities. And we do recognize that there are municipalities like the City of Toronto and City of Guelph that have done a lot of good work, but others that still need to be brought along, and we're absolutely looking at the next step of building that ecosystem out further, supporting our municipalities. And the federal government is very aligned on that as well.
I can't not jump in here.
Of course.
So one project that we actually have going on right now, it's called the Do-It-Yourself Toolkit for municipalities that want to initiate an open data program or a project, right? Because if we talk about open data from a leadership perspective, it's not good enough to have a few cities that claim, the prize, whatever that prize is, It's good that we have leaders, but, I think there's also a responsibility as a community to be able to share these best practices for the benefit of the broader kind of ecosystem, right? And so, with this project, the Do-It-Yourself Toolkit, what we've done is that we've connected 15 cities from across the country to provide us with their advice on how to design the content of that toolkit. And it's been a really, really kind of great experience because it not only recognizes their own experience, right, and their own leadership and, expertise, but it also kind of broadens and helps us have like a much more, kind of a broader conversation about kind of interoperability from a common understanding of what we mean by open data for the benefit of Canadians more broadly. So we'll be launching the DIY in the next couple of weeks at the Canadian Open Data Summit in Edmonton on June 12th and 13th. And yeah, I'm happy to share any more information about that. But that's something that could definitely be scaled across the country, including here.
Well, it's a great way to end because there's a practical solution there that obviously if you want to connect with Jean-Noé and follow up either through Orion to be able to get more information about the DIY, but also it's also, at least from my perspective, a great way to sort of wrap the open theme, but also Orion's being the host of this conversation, not only this panel, but the conference in general, because it also feels like the role that Orion does play and can play and probably will continue to play at a greater level going forward, because we are living in this time where this sort of collaboration and mobilization requires convening, requires people who are uniquely positioned to be able to bring these conversations together, have them trickle down to the stakeholders at all levels, while everybody else is focused on doing what they're doing within their silos and doing their best to reach out and connect. It's always helpful to have somebody that can do it from that 10,000 foot level as well and keep everybody sort of together and connected so that you continue to communicate, connect, and co-create, not only in Ontario and Canada, but around the world. So for that, thank you very much.
Thank you.